Managing liability panel. Good work for getting the ice cream. I was in the other session. Half of them got ice cream, so I think you guys have much more restraint, self-restraint. This is the managing liability panel. We wanted to have this panel specifically because Keisha said that this was managing liability was an issue that a lot of people in Montana are grappling with. And so we've specifically set up these panels so that there's plenty of time for questions and answers. And we've decided for this panel that if you have questions in between each presentation, correct, that's how we're doing it?
I think what we'd like to do is, if you have a question about what someone specifically said and want to get clarified, let's do it while they're talking. Otherwise, maybe let's roll through the presentations and see if maybe, because we're all hitting different pieces, will give us a chance to see if we can address your topic, and then we're going to save plenty of time at the end for whatever questions you have.
So we are going to get started. Scott, you're
Okay.
no, you're first.
Cindy is first.
Okay, Cindy, you're first.
I was going to. Do you have the?
Oh, sorry. Do I have the? Someone took it for. Oh, wait.
It's right on you.
Okay, I get. Hi, I'm Scott Rice with Open Hearts. I'm your moderator, and I guess I just got handed the bio, so forgive me if I just read them or summarize them. Our first speaker is Cindy Brooks with MDQ. She's a senior legal counsel. She specializes in Superfund law and has been the lead attorney for the state program since 1995. She's been a speaker at numerous state and federal conferences on topics of Superfund, voluntary remediation, lender liability, and liability allocations. And since I don't want anyone to read the rest of my bio, I'm not going to read the rest of hers. But she's very experienced in the topics you're about to hear about, and her focus is going to really be talking about state law issues. And then you'll hear a little bit more. I'll be talking a little bit about the federal issues, and Alan will be talking about some of the other issues. So let me turn over to Cindy, and then we'll go from there.
All right, thank you. I don't think we have microphones. Can everyone hear me? The first thing I should tell you is lawyers don't do PowerPoint. So forgive me if it doesn't work properly. As Scott said, I'm Cindy Brooks, and I've been with the Montana Department of Environmental Quality as their Superfund attorney since 1995. So I'm one of the grandmas of the program. There's a few of us that have been around for a decade plus, and I'm one of those. So my presentation today is going to focus primarily on liability issues from the governmental perspective, specifically state liability under the State Superfund Act that I'm going to talk a little bit about. We're focusing today on Superfund liability, and all three of the speakers today are going to do that. And the reason we're focusing on Superfund is the liability provisions in Superfund tend to be the broadest of any environmental law, and they also tend to be able to cover just about every kind of contamination that can be found at a site. So these same principles may apply at other sites like petroleum release sites and water quality sites, but because Superfund again is so broad, our focus today is really going to be Superfund liability. Montana has a state Superfund program of its own, and it's called CECRA, which stands for the Comprehensive Environmental Cleanup and Responsibility Act. It's found in the Montana Code annotated at Title 75, Chapter 10, Part 7. And this is the state equivalency of the federal law, which is called CERCLA.
Now I have to hold something.
Well, no, you can put it on.
Okay. Okay, is that better? Okay. It feels like I'm yelling, but the people in the back are going like this. So. Okay. So there's a federal law, CERCLA, and we're going to talk a little bit today about CERCLA, but primarily we're going to focus on the state equivalent CECRA. Section 75-10-715 of the Montana Code Annotated lays out the liability sections that are found in the state Superfund law. And as I mentioned a moment earlier, the liability provisions that are found in state Superfund are very broad. The statute specifically provides for strict, joint, and several liability, and that's one of the reasons why Superfund is very powerful, and it can also be very scary if you are a city or county or a developer that's looking to do a cleanup on a site that may have Superfund implications, it can be scary because of that. Strict liability means if you fall into one of a defined category of parties under the statute, you are responsible for the cleanup without regard to fault. And we're going to go through what those categories are. I'm going to give you kind of a general definition of them. But really, just about anybody that has any connection to the property, the facility, the operation, or the waste can be held liable for cleanup. The strict joint, or the joint and several portion of it means that you're responsible for 100% of cleanup costs, along with anybody else that may be considered liable under the statute. So if there are, the 3 people in the front row have been identified as being liable parties at a site, and the man on the left can't pay, DEQ can look to the other 2 parties to pay any or all. That's what joint and several liability means. It means all of it, along with everybody else. The 4 categories of parties that are considered to be strictly liable under the statute, as I mentioned, fall into 4 general categories, and if you're interested in getting the exact verbiage, we can get that for you, but we generally call them current owners and operators. If you own property that is contaminated, or you operate on property that's contaminated, you are liable for cleanup. Doesn't matter if you put the waste there, doesn't matter if you did it, you're liable for the cleanup. Past owners and operators are our second category of liable persons. If you were an owner or operator, sorry, we're getting a lot of back. Is that better? Yes? Okay.
So you can move.
So now you can't hear. Yeah, I don't know why it's really got a hum. If you owned the property or operated on the property at the time that waste was disposed on that property, you're considered a past owner or operator that has Superfund liability. The third category is generally referred to as generators. If you are the person who generated the waste, you can be held liable for cleanup. And finally, the last category under state Superfund law is what we call transporters. If you're a company who transported the waste to a disposal or treatment facility, the act of transporting that waste from one location to the other can get you liability under the state Superfund law. Again, these provisions are meant to be broad and to reach out and touch anybody that has nexus to the property, the facility, or the contamination. And the policy decision behind joint and several liability, both at the congressional level and at the state level, is that it's better to have people connected to that contamination pay for the cost of cleanup than it is to put that cost of cleanup onto the taxpayers. So that's a policy call that Congress made. So we know what kind of liability is potentially out there in terms of the broadest liability. The next thing that we want to know is when might that liability attach? There's really 4 factors that have to be met in order for liability to attach. And I passed out some definitions, some statutory definitions. All of the attorneys that are presenting today felt like we should give you a general overview, and then because liability is so fact and site specific, we thought it would be better to have lots of time for questions and answers. So I don't want to stand up here and read definitions to you. So again, just a general overview, and please, any questions you have, we'd be happy to answer. But the first item that has to be present for at a facility for liability to attach is you have to have a release. A lot of times people are under the impression that a release means I had to dump something or somebody had to spill something. That's not actually the case. If you look at the first definition on your list, release includes active items like dumping and spilling, but it also includes passive migration like leaching. Leaching by definition is a release. So if you have contamination in the groundwater and it got there through the process of leaching through contaminated soils, that is considered a release to the groundwater. It didn't have to be done through an active mechanism. The release has to be of a hazardous or deleterious substance, and that's the second definition that's on the sheet we handed you. And essentially, that means that the substance has to be on the CERCLA list of hazardous waste or the RCRA list of hazardous waste, or it has to be a petroleum product. And this is one area where the state Superfund law differs from federal Superfund law. CERCLA specifically has an exemption for petroleum products. They're not addressed under federal Superfund, and they are under state. So PRS sites, leaky tank sites, those could potentially fall under the purview of state Superfund law. You also have to have that release of a hazardous or deleterious substance into the environment, which is the third definition on your sheet. Importantly, environment includes not only groundwater and surface water, it also includes soils and air. So any of those, if there's any of releases into that environmental media, you have the release that's enough to trigger liability. And finally, that release of a hazardous or deleterious substance has to come from a facility. And this is an area where we tend to have disagreement with parties about what does a facility mean. A lot of people think a facility means the tank, the building, the treatment area. Unfortunately, if you, from your perspective, if you look at the last definition on your sheet, it's true that that is a facility, but the statutory definition goes on to say it's all of those things plus any location where that contamination has come to be located. And I think we all know intuitively that contamination doesn't recognize property boundaries, which means you could have a spill on your property that could migrate and impact properties off of your operations. That, under the definition in the State Superfund law, is also considered part of the facility. And that's how facilities get really complicated really quick, because all of a sudden you're not just dealing with your 1 acre parcel where you had your petroleum spill. You're dealing with your property plus the property of your down gradient neighbors, for example, because of the migration of that contamination. So wherever the contamination comes to be located, that's your facility. Again, without regard to property boundaries. And then finally, before DEQ will take action on a release of a hazardous substance into the environment from a facility, DEQ has to determine that there's an imminent and substantial endangerment posed by that release. This is a determination made by DEQ in its regulatory discretion, and the way that DEQ defines imminent and substantial endangerment is that contaminant concentrations at that site exist, and those contaminant concentrations exceed certain screening levels. And once the screening levels are triggered, there's a potential threat, and DEQ will evaluate the site. There are a number of screening levels that we use. Probably the most important ones and the most commonly used are the DEQ 7 standards, which are Montana's promulgated water quality standards. We also use our risk-based corrective action, risk-based screening levels, and we also use EPA regional screening levels that were just promulgated in May of this year. We also have some sediment screening levels and some air screening levels, but primarily those are the ones we use. So, we have a site, and there's potential Superfund liability out there. If you are the person owning or operating that property and you are looking at potential liability, the first thing you want to do is figure out how can you get out of it. Because there's really only two things that happen in Superfund. You're either in or you're out, and you really don't want to be in if you don't have to be in. So the first place you want to look to find out if you can get out is find out whether or not there's a definitional exclusion for you. In the definition of owner or operator, there's a specific exclusion for state or local governments that acquire property through involuntary means. So if you're a local government and you have a contaminated site in your neighborhood and the person's quit paying property taxes and you end up with it because the taxes haven't been paid, there's a definitional exclusion. You may not be considered an owner or operator. Yes?
Will that also work with eminent domain as well?
That is less clear. There's a defense for that, but eminent domain is not typically viewed as being involuntary because that's an action that you're taking voluntarily to get the property. So there's a defense, and it's a little bit it's not as clear. But typically it's not going to apply for eminent domain. But things like tax foreclosure, bankruptcy, one of the things we've seen pretty commonly are bankruptcies where a party files bankruptcy and abandons the property in bankruptcy, and then the property just sits. Banks don't want to touch it because it's contaminated, nobody wants to buy it, and it's just sitting there abandoned. And we've had some occasions where that's happened, and if the local government can't step in and do something with that, it's just going to continue to sit. So if you can meet that definitional exclusion, that's the first place to start, particularly for state and local governments. One of the things I would caution you about, we've seen state or local government agencies step in and take property involuntarily and then turn around and lease it to a polluter. You will lose your exclusion if you do that. Not a good thing to do. So you want to be careful once you have your exclusion that you don't lose your exclusion because of some actions you take later. We also have in SECRA very strong secured creditor protections in the statute. In federal Superfund, these were written in, EPA promulgated these by rule. Ours are statutory, and they're very strong. And what they say is, if you are a secured creditor, a bank or another entity that takes some sort of indicia of ownership, a trust deed or a mortgage on a piece of property to secure your interest in that property, you are not going to become liable unless you essentially step in and start running their environmental operations. You can engage in financial workouts. You can give them general advice on operations. You can foreclose and take title to the property, and you will not become an owner and operator if the reason you're doing that is to protect your security interests. They're very broad, and that was something I heard come up in this morning's presentation, a concern for banks. The Montana legislature recognized that and has codified those protections for secured creditors right into the statute. The state Superfund law also has some defenses. We have 7 defenses, and I'm not going to go into much detail about those defenses because, again, they are so site-specific and fact-specific. It's really difficult for me to explain those to you. What you need to know is there are some defenses. They're generally difficult to establish. You want to try to find yourself an exclusion before you move to looking whether or not you can establish a defense. The exclusion is the better way to go for you. And if you are looking at a defense, think you might have a defense, you're going to need to talk to your legal counsel about that. But we do have 7 defenses to liability in the Superfund law. And then finally, the really good news for a lot of people in Montana is that we have exclusions from liability now that we did not used to have. We have 3, and they're very powerful exclusions, and I'm going to give you some examples about how they've helped people a lot at various sites around the state. We have an exclusion for, we call it the household garbage exclusion. And in the early 80s when Superfund was just starting, federal Superfund, there were horror stories across the country about mega landfill sites where a landfill would become a federal Superfund site, and the next thing you'd know, you'd have 1,000 people identified because they'd taken garbage there. And we wanted to make sure that we never had something like that happen in Montana, so we have an exclusion for household garbage. If you just took garbage to a landfill, or you're a transportation company that just hauled household garbage, you're excluded. It's not a defense. You don't have to prove it. You've got it in the statute, an exclusion. I've never seen that used since it was added to the statute in 1997, but we wanted to make sure we didn't ever have a mega landfill site in Montana if we could avoid it. So that's in the statute. The really important and probably most critical one for you is the subsurface migration exclusion. Again, this is written right into the statute, and it codifies a policy that the department had early on, since I came on in 1995, but this is now statutory. And here's what it says in a nutshell. If you own contaminated property, and the only contamination on your property is in the groundwater, and the contamination is coming from an upgradient source, you are not considered liable under the statute. Now of course, there's always some things you have to do to maintain your exclusion. You have to cooperate with DEQ and the people that are conducting the remedial action, but if all you have is groundwater contamination from an upgradient source, you're not considered to be a PLP, which is the acronym we use for potentially liable persons under the state law. We had a site in Bozeman, Montana. It's still a site. There was a release from a shopping center. The groundwater plume is now 3 miles long, and it dives under the East Gallatin River. Under traditional Superfund theory, every single business and every single resident that lived on top of that 3-mile-long groundwater plume would have Superfund liability. The department said that makes no sense. That's not appropriate. And so now statutorily, those people no longer have to worry about the specter of Superfund liability. It's simply not an issue for them. This is also a tool that you can use when you're looking at buying property that may be impacted by a Superfund site. And I can give you a couple of examples. We have a large Superfund site in Whitefish, Montana, and it's right next to the downtown. And I don't know how many of you have been up to Whitefish lately, but that is a very rapidly growing community, lots of development downtown, and lots of people wanting to buy and sell businesses across the street from this facility, and people concerned about liability and banks concerned about protecting any mortgages or money they may loan on it, and they're requiring environmental assessments of that property. And those people that are conducting that work are able to do environmental assessments, and as long as they can show us that they have no contamination in their soils and all they have is some impacts in the groundwater from the off-site contamination, we're able to tell them that they're not going to be considered liable for that site. We also had a site in Kalispell where we actually noticed a party and said, we believe you have liability under the state Superfund law. That company went out, did an assessment of the property, showed us that the only contamination at the site, at their property, was in the groundwater, that they didn't have any sources in the soil, and we actually redacted that notice letter and said, you know, we think you've established it, you don't have liability, and you're not considered to be in the mix anymore. And then the third exclusion is what we call the residential landowner exclusion. And again, in a nutshell, it says if you are a residential landowner and you have a piece of property that's 20 acres or less, so long as when you purchased that property, there were no visible indications of contamination on the surface of the property, like pipes sticking up out of the ground or a mine dump in the backyard, as long as visually the property looked okay when you bought it, if we find out later there's contamination there, you're not responsible for that. And the theory there is that we don't expect residential landowners in Montana to go out and do environmental assessments when they're buying residential property. We think it's reasonable to do that if you're buying commercial property, but we don't think every landowner or every person who wants to go buy a home should be expected to do that. So again, there's some restrictions. You have to cooperate with the department. If we need to get access onto your property to put in a monitoring well or something like that, you need to cooperate to maintain your exclusion. But again, we significantly reduce the amount of people that may get brought in on a Superfund liability case.
Cindy, does that hold for somebody who might have a home business on residential property?
Well, we've had to deal with that, but the statute says it's for residential purposes, and it doesn't define residential purposes. And so that is going to be a site-by-site basis. If somebody had a shop on there and they were doing auto repair and that was their business with their home next door, which isn't an uncommon practice in Montana, I don't believe that exclusion would hold. If you're talking about somebody who's selling Avon and has, you know, 2 drawers in their house where they keep their Avon, then I think we're probably okay. So it's going to be fact specific on whether or not the purpose of that property is really residential or really commercial. But we have seen that, and there's an argument there. It's a gray area. I'm going to very briefly mention the interface of seeker with the Brownfields legislation, since the Brownfields is why we're here. In 2002, Congress passed the Brownfields legislation, and I can never remember the entire title, so I put it at the top of the slide for you. The Brownfields legislation provides that if you go out and do all appropriate inquiry and due diligence, that you may be able to claim liability protections for innocent landowners and bona fide purchasers and contiguous property owners. And what I want you to know is that those protections would cover you for CERCLA liability, federal liability. The federal Brownfields legislation does not impact determinations under state law or necessarily mitigate them. So you can go out and do your due diligence and receive a bona fide purchaser exception from liability under federal law, but that doesn't necessarily translate to state law. So you need to realize that they're both independent laws, and you may be not liable under one, but you still may have some issues under another. So you want to keep that in mind. And I think Scott's going to talk to you a little bit more about that legislation during his presentation. He's doing what we call mop-up. He's going to wait and see what Ellen and I say, and whatever we missed or he didn't like, he's going to set you straight.
Maybe we'll get out early.
Yeah. Talk faster. You're in the mix. There's been a release. We've got a hazardous substance. We've defined our facility, and you couldn't find a way to get out of it. Like I said, you're in or you're out. Now you're in. So now what are you going to do? Again, I'm speaking to you from the regulatory standpoint, but from DEQ's perspective, the best thing you can do to mitigate your liability is get in there and clean it up as fast as you can. That's the best thing you can do. The quicker the better. It will have less chance to spread, it will have less chance to impact third parties. Alan's going to talk to you a little bit about the new specter of third-party liability in Montana for tort actions from people that live downgrading of sites that have impacted their residential property. The best thing you can do, get in, do it the way DEQ wants you to do it. That's my tout for the agency. And do it quickly. Really, the longer you drag it out, the worse it's going to be. Just suck it up, do what you need to do, and get that property back into reuse. That's the best thing you can do. And there's 3 ways to address DEQ's requirements. Yes, sir.
What kind of liability does the state incur by managing projects that take several years to go to cleanup? And then they've impacted a bunch of extra properties from the initial discovery?
Well, traditionally there hasn't been liability for that because the responsibility for doing the cleanup is on the parties who are liable under the statute, and DEQ is not one of them. And in the third-party actions that we're seeing around the state of Montana that Alan's going to speak to you about a little more, DEQ's not been a party to those. So traditionally, regulatory agency doesn't incur liability by undertaking its statutory obligations.
But are they under like petroleum release fund? Aren't they the ones dictating what gets done on a site with the withholding of funds if it's not done the way that they want to do?
You know, I don't work at all with the petroleum release fund. I could probably find an answer for you. I see some DEQ people here.
Shortly to that, the responsibility of the cleanup is regardless of whether or not you're getting money from the federal fund. The owner operator has to use the site, they get reimbursement from that fund. But regardless of whether they're getting reimbursement from the fund, they are still responsible for cleanup. Period.
That funding is gravy, is what she's saying. You have to do it. If you get some reimbursement, that's, yeah. Maybe. Again, there's three ways that you can address your cleanup obligations under the state Superfund law. The traditional route, you can go through the voluntary cleanup process, which we'll talk about briefly. And then there's sort of a hybrid we're going to talk to you about called CALA, which is a way to allocate your liability, and it's a way to deviate from the joint and several liability provisions that are the norm. Under the traditional route, you would complete a remedial investigation to determine the nature and extent of the contamination, a risk analysis to evaluate site-specific cleanup numbers that are acceptable to the department, and then you would prepare